Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending this presentation concerning extreme winds on built environment and recent changes in building codes. This is being presented for Division 1 of the American Bar Association Forum on Construction Law. My name is Mike Lane with Lane Law Group in New Orleans, and I have the pleasure of presenting this today with two renowned experts in the industry, Dr. John Simsir and Dr. Anurag Jain with Walker Consultants. Dr. Jain is a licensed PE in 7 states with more than 27 years of experience designing, analyzing, and investigating structures for extreme loads. He has led investigations to determine the extent of wind-induced damage and collapse of more than 2,500 structures worldwide. His post-disaster assessment experience includes investigations of the World Trade Center collapse after 9/11 and several other high-profile collapses. Dr. Jain currently serves as the chair of ASCE's Structural Wind Engineering Committee, and he has co-authored more than 80 peer-reviewed technical publications, recently publishing the ASCE Pre-Standard for Performance-Based Wind Design, and also co-authored an example in the recently published SEOC Wind Design Manual. Dr. Jain has testified as an expert witness in more than 80 depositions and more than a dozen trials. Dr. John Simsir is a licensed engineer in 7 states with more than 17 years of experience in providing consulting and expert services for investigation and dispute resolution concerning structures damaged or collapsed by natural or man-made hazards, including wind, flood, earthquake, and others. Dr. Simsir provides peer review services for design of structures and performs advanced analysis and evaluation of existing structures. Dr. Simsir is the recipient of the ACEC National Engineering Excellence Grand Award for World Trade Center 7, Collapse Analysis and Assessment. Dr. Simsir has co-authored more than 40 peer-reviewed technical publications and has testified in many depositions, mediations, and appraisal hearings. As for myself, I am an attorney practicing in New Orleans, Louisiana. In addition to handling a variety of construction disputes, I currently represent businesses in connection with property insurance claims. Earlier in my career, I represented dozens of insurance companies for hundreds of property insurance claims after Hurricane Katrina. So my career actually began in the midst of one of the most devastating hurricanes to strike the US. After graduating Tulane Law School in May of 2005, I took the bar exam in July of that year, exactly 1 month prior to Hurricane Katrina. As a lowly associate, having worked at the firm for only 2 weeks, I didn't receive a paycheck and I didn't know the hurricane evacuation plan. It took about 3 or 4 weeks before I realized that my firm had moved to Lafayette temporarily. Fortunately, I learned that I still had a job and I moved to Lafayette for several months before moving back to New Orleans. One historical footnote that is relevant to today's presentation somewhat is that many people don't know that Hurricane Katrina, the bar exam results were stored in the basement of the Supreme Court building here in New Orleans. Because one section of the bar exam was destroyed by the floodwaters, many students had to retake parts of the bar exam. Luckily, I was not one of the students that had to retake any part of the bar exam. I currently represent hotel owners, schools, restaurants, high rises, and other commercial buildings in their property insurance claims, specifically as it relates to Hurricane Laura, which struck Louisiana in August of 2020, as well as Hurricane Ida, which struck Louisiana in August of 2021. These 2 Category 4 storms with wind speeds of up to 150 miles per hour were the most powerful hurricanes to impact Louisiana since 1856, even more powerful than Hurricane Katrina. I'm glad to say that we survived August of this year with no major or minor storms. But the topic we're discussing here today is very important because there's no question that we have seen a rise in the frequency and power of the storms that have made landfall in recent years. So with that being said, let's move on to the presentation. If you do have questions, please submit them in the chat box and we'll try to answer them as we go. We will reserve a few minutes at the end in case any questions are not answered before that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Simsir, who is going to discuss the investigation of wind damage to structures.
Thank you, Mike, for those kind words and introduction. Let me share my screen here. Hope everyone is able to see my screen. And you've introduced us already, Anurag, Jain, and myself, John Simsir. So good afternoon, everyone. Today I will be talking about the various windstorms that generate intense winds and the impact of these winds on buildings and other structures. And then in the second part of this presentation, my colleague Anurag will discuss the various building code issues as they relate to wind loads on built environment. There are many different types of windstorms. We have thunderstorms, hurricanes, tornadoes, waterspouts, downbursts, derechos, and others. And then we also have sometimes a combination of these various storms. For instance, you might have tornadoes within a hurricane system that are spawned by the hurricane. These intense windstorms routinely generate intense winds, and wind flow over buildings and other structures generates wind pressures on these structures. So I will be discussing about these shortly. These pressures cause damage to buildings. In addition, windstorms also generate debris that are picked up by the winds. They become airborne and impact buildings, again, causing further damage. Another thing that happens with the debris impacts and pressurization of the exteriors is that you sometimes get breaches of the building envelope. And by building envelope, we are referring to the cladding of the building, the windows and doors, and the roofing. And when these envelopes get breached, interiors are pressurized, and water is also making its way into the building interiors, causing further damage. So potential damage from these events sometimes is dismissed based on wind speed alone. But there are other factors other than wind speed to take into account that affect buildings and that potentially damage them. So we'll be looking into those factors as well during this presentation. Damage caused by windstorms. There are several types of damage listed here, but I think there's more that can be added onto this list. For the roofs, definitely we see blown off, uplifted, and impacted roofs. We see collapsed brick facades, localized structural failures in buildings and other structures. As I mentioned, windborne debris impact is a big concern. When these breach glazing and other components in the cladding, they'll damage not just the interiors, but also cause damage to the framing components of these window and door systems. And as the interiors are breached, you'll get pressurization of the interiors, which will cause damage to the interior partitions in the buildings. This is an illustration of an airplane wing. You see the cross section of the wing in the middle. And this is a video that shows the wind flow around the wing. As you can see in this video, the flow is smooth and streamlined. It's what we call a laminar flow. And the wind flow around the wings is one thing, but the wind flow around obstacles like buildings is an altogether different environment. So in the next slide, you'll see, hope the video plays all right. So what you're seeing is a block in the laboratory that simulates a building and the wind flow that's coming at the building. Buildings are essentially obstacles in the wind. When the wind impacts the building, it creates a turbulent flow that goes around the building. It creates vortices, such as this horseshoe vortex that you see in the middle here. Now, a question that we are sometimes asked in our investigations is that, can the wind impact multiple building elevations? And the quick answer to that is yes, the wind does impact multiple elevations. It is not just the wind-facing elevation of a building that is impacted by wind. The windward side of a building is seen here on the left side. As the wind approaches the building, it generates positive pressures on the windward side of the building, and it generates suction pressures outward from the building on the other three elevations of the building. And if you look at the building from the side, you'll see the roof. As the wind flows over the roof, it again creates suction pressures on the roof. And these pressures are generated due to those vortices that I had shown earlier. These suction pressures can be quite significant. They can be up to twice the windward pressures. And they can also be significant across the height of the building. And they may not be reducing closer to the ground. In fact, they may have the same intensity as you see it on the roof level of the building.
Dr. Simsir, let me jump
Yes.
in and ask one question. I think there is a misconception in the industry that the leeward side of the building is not impacted to the extent as the windward side that receives the brunt of the impact of the wind. Can the leeward side of the building sustain damage given enough wind speed to the windward side of the building?
Correct. So as you can see in these images, the leeward side is subjected to intense suction pressures in addition to the positive pressures on the windward side. So you will see pressurization of the exterior facade on the leeward side of the building. Now, in some storms, such as a hurricane that affects a property, as this hurricane passes over the property, you will see a complete reversal of wind direction. And that means that the building elevations that were subjected to positive pressures before will now be subjected to negative pressures once the storm passes over the property. So your windward might become leeward, and your leeward might become windward during the course of a hurricane going over the property. And that's another reason that the leeward side may also see wind pressures, because that becomes a positive side of the building, or windward side of the building. And as I had mentioned earlier, another phenomenon that occurs is the internal pressurization of the building that you see in these two bottom images. And if there is a breach in the building envelope, then that interior pressurization will be even more. And that interior pressurization will add on to the exterior pressures that are outside the building. And so the building will be subjected to even larger pressures. This is a laboratory simulation of winds coming at a roof. And that wind flow over the roof creates conical vortices that are shown in this illustration, the bottom right. And you'll see this horseshoe pattern forming in the roofing gravel. And it's not just in the laboratory, but we see this in the field on building tops where roofing gravel has been scoured in a horseshoe pattern due to those vortices that are generated on the rooftops during a hurricane or other intense storms. Now, wind is dynamic. The wind flow is not constant. The wind fluctuates with time. In fact, it can fluctuate several times a second. This top figure shows that you have some steady winds of about 50 to 60 miles per hour, which is that solid line in the middle. But then you have fluctuations going over 100 miles per hour. These higher fluctuations are referred to as wind gusts to differentiate from the sustained winds. And the bottom figure is the phenomenon that I had mentioned earlier, where a hurricane might change. The hurricane moves over a property, and the wind direction during that passage of the hurricane will change. So with in this figure, you know, you have winds coming from the north northwest, and then it suddenly drops to the south and then goes back to north again.
Now, Dr. Simsir, is that typical that you see that in many extreme wind events, category 3 and 4 hurricanes, tornadoes, derechos, and others?
Yes, I mean, especially in hurricanes, regardless of the intensity of the hurricane, if the eye of the storm passes over a property, or it's, you know, if the property is close to the eye of the storm, you'll see this intense change in direction of the wind. But for other storms like tornadoes, you might see that as well if the tornado is very close to the property. This dynamic nature of the wind and its fluctuation that I just mentioned causes fluctuating pressures on building components. You see in this video the windows in our office building in downtown LA buffeting in a mild windstorm in a regular day, on a regular regular storm in LA. So this is called buffeting of these components. And when you consider that you might see several fluctuating cycles a second, then in, say, a long duration storm, such as a hurricane, these components and their connections may buffet repeatedly for thousands of cycles over many hours during the storm. These fluctuations and buffeting of many components across a building will cause the buildings to move and sway in a storm. This video is from New York in a thunderstorm, where you see this tall building on the right-hand side of this video moves to the right and left during the storm. And it's also a little bit, there's also a little bit of a twist in the building on the right.
One thing that we see commonly with hurricane, property insurance claims is if the window is not cracked or displaced, no damage has occurred, according to the insurance company adjuster. Is it possible that the building envelope could be compromised by this buffeting action or the movement or vibration of the windows in an extreme wind scenario?
Yes, so it is potentially possible. For instance, these windows will bend and deform under pressure during the storm, even if they don't break. The framing joints of the windows will get exercised with buffeting. I have an animation later on that will illustrate this phenomenon of a door. In addition, the window gaskets and glazing stops will displace and loosen as well. So all of this will create avenues for water to infiltrate through the window and into the building, even though the window may appear intact and undeformed after a storm. It's best to inspect those windows after a storm. Now, these videos you see here were taken during regular mild storms. You can expect to see more deformation during stronger storms. Another thing I wanted to mention, that the corner zones and edge zones in a building and the components in those zones will experience higher pressures during the winds, and they'll be more adversely affected in those areas. We often hear about the 74-mile-per-hour wind that starts a hurricane when a windstorm becomes a hurricane. But we note that that's the sustained wind speed over water. As that hurricane moves over land, the wind speed that's defined as a hurricane will drop. So for instance, on this table in the middle, we see the gust wind speed over water. And on the right-hand side, we see the gust wind speed over land. And you can see there's a drop in the threshold of hurricane, drops from 90 to 81 miles per hour. So a sustained wind is defined as a 1-minute wind in the building codes. That's the wind that's averaged over a 1-minute period. If you look at the gust, it's defined as a 3-second average wind. And so the wind speeds can be, measured for different averaging times, whether it's 3 second, 5 second, 1 minute, 2 minute. But it's important to be mindful of these averaging, because you might end up seeing different wind speeds for the same windstorm in an event. The height at which the wind speed is reported is also important. But the building code provides tools for us to convert these numbers from or in between each other.
One additional thing, or many additional things that we look at in addition to wind speeds when evaluating the impact on structures is the structure itself. The age and condition of the structure are essential in evaluating potential damage. Every building is different. Older buildings are more likely to sustain damage. Poorly maintained buildings sustain higher levels of damage in the same wind environment. One interesting thing that I found interesting in my career is that we learned after Katrina that some of the safest places to harbor during the storm were in the housing developments that were built in the 1940s and the 1980s. I mean, 1940s and 50s, sorry. And although those were older buildings, they were built in the post-World War II era when buildings where different materials were used, better materials. Those buildings were built to last. Newer construction means and methods may be more susceptible in certain circumstances than older buildings, depending on the time frame. Another important factor is the looseness of the building. That's not a technical term, but that is the term that engineers will use to address permeation of the barrier, of the envelope. If the building is loose, it's not tight, air and moisture can get into the building, and obviously during an extreme wind event, that can cause additional damage. And finally, one additional factor that has to be considered is the height of the building. And Dr. Simsir is going to discuss how the height of the building may play an important role as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah, so the next question is, does wind speed always increase with height? And the short answer to that is no. We have some windstorms such as tornadoes and downbursts that will have a variation of wind speed over the height or the altitude. In a conventional straight line wind, you'll see that the wind speeds will gradually increase over height until they reach a constant value. That's the dashed line here on the right-hand side. But in a tornado, for instance, or a downburst, the wind speed will vary over the height of the building in such a way that some of the elevations closer to the ground will be exposed to higher wind speeds than the higher elevations. So it's important to understand the nature of the windstorm and how the wind speeds are generated and what the wind speed profile is across the height of the building. This is a cool video of a downburst from Austria. As you can see in this video, there's a storm approaching, and as it's approaching and going over the lake, it dumps a whole lot of water. But you can see how the winds are in that downburst. They go vertical downward, and then from there they spread out. So the wind has a downward and outward flow in a downburst. In a tornado, it's the opposite. So the tornado will suck the winds from its surroundings. So you see an inward flow towards the vortex of the tornado, and then upward flow after that. But here in a downburst, it's the opposite. Again, here I'm comparing the various wind speed profiles for tornadoes of varying radiuses, or radii. And these are very different from a straight line wind that you see in the black in these figures. So the size and the radius of the vortex of the tornado is another factor in these windstorms. This is the video of a gustnado, as it's called, which is a small tornado that comes over land, but then goes over water and turns into a water spout. So as it moved over that building on the white building at the back, it created significant damage to the roof and windows of that building. The wind pressures on that building were amplified due to the nature of the wind flow of this water spout. So you would end up with wind pressures that are more or the same wind speed that you would see from a straight line wind. So non-synoptic winds, these are what we would call winds for tornadoes or water spouts or other windstorms where you have vertical and rotational winds profiles in addition to horizontal winds that you would typically see in straight line winds. So by non-synoptic, I am referring to these winds that include vertical and rotational components to the horizontal component. And they regularly damage structures. These additional components contribute to the wind profile. And if the wind speeds are even lower than design speed, it doesn't mean that the building will not get damaged. So that criteria should not be the sole basis for the evaluation of these buildings for damage. And so understanding the wind and its interaction with the structure is critical to our understanding of design and investigation issues. And of course, the wind load path is critical to design and investigation as well.
Now, let me ask one question for the lay people who are attending this presentation, many of whom are lawyers and don't know what words like synoptic mean. Could you just, as best as you can, explain the difference between synoptic winds versus non-synoptic winds?
Yes, so synoptic winds refer to the general typical winds that we see, which have only horizontal components. We call these straight line winds or straight winds. But non-synoptic winds would be winds you would see that have additional components of wind flow, such as vertical winds or rotational winds. These would be typical in tornadoes or water spouts, downbursts, or sometimes referred to as microbursts. So those would be the non-synoptic winds.
Fair enough. I think I got it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about whether shutters, across windows can prevent wind damage to the structure.
Yes, so we have a colleague in our office who has actually contributed to a paper on this topic. We sometimes see presence of shutters on windows and balconies of buildings. These definitely have a reduction. They provide reduction in the impact of windborne debris and wind-driven rain on these systems, but they do not provide protection of the doors and windows from wind-induced pressures because the wind pressure equalizes between the front and the back of the shutters, which again exposes the doors and windows to similar wind pressure differentials that you would see in the absence of shutters. So here is a picture of a blown off sliding glass door that was protected by the shutters, but the shutters that do not provide protection from the wind pressurization. The building codes state that you need to provide either impact rated glazing for these windows and doors, or if you have a regular door, you can provide shutters. But note that there's no reduction in the design pressures for these shutters, for these windows when they have shutters on them. And so it becomes important to understand the performance of these components. And this is the animation that I had mentioned earlier, where we put a sliding glass door panel in a computer model and put wind loads acting on it, which pressurizes and bends, deforms the sliding glass door, which then causes the framing joints to open up and rotate, which allows water to intrude. And this here is a video of that animation that shows the sliding glass door deforming under wind loads, and this framing joint opens up and closes during the storm. And here is a view from the back side of that same joint. Another issue we always see is roof tiles on buildings. The wind pressures will cause them to flutter. And this is a laboratory experiment of a small tiled house. And you'll notice in this video that the tiles, even though they're not blown off, they keep on fluttering. And at some point, as the wind speed gets higher, they might blow off or blow away from the building. That blown away tiles will cause further damage to other tiles in the roof. And so this fluttering is important because it causes tiles to uplift and shift around and impact other tiles, which might cause them to crack and break, even though they may not be blown off. One last slide from me is this. As the technology gets better, we start doing inspections by drones. However, we should be mindful of the capacity or the limits of drone inspections. In this slide, you see the picture on the top right corner where we are looking at the roof of a building, and the rectangles in blue are the areas where the drone located damage to the roof tiles, where the roof tiles were either blown off or broken. But when we walk the roofs ourselves, when we do a hands-on inspection, we saw a lot more damage. So we added the areas of damage where we saw additional breakage of tiles, and we marked them up with the red rectangles. And so when you combine the two, you see that there is a lot more damage to the roof than what the drone can see.
Dr. Simsir, these are clearly the type of roof tiles that we see more commonly along the Gulf Coast, more so in Florida, Alabama, than you'll find here in Louisiana or Texas, where we typically have asphalt shingle roofing or mod bit roofing. My question is, would you expect to see similar impacts on that type of roofing material as well, the displacement that may lead to potential damage to the underlayment of the roof or surrounding shingles or materials under extreme wind stresses?
Yes, so you can expect to have displacements to occur during the storm. So when you look at them after the storm, they may not appear to have moved. During the storm, the roofing membrane, not necessarily tiles, but roofing membrane such as modified bitumen that you had mentioned will uplift due to those suction pressures I mentioned earlier. It will cause blisters, bubbles to form in the membrane, and it will cause separations at the seams of the roofing membrane. And this will allow water to seep under the membrane and cause water damage to interiors. And with time, this damage will worsen as more water will make its way underneath the roofing. And so it is essential that these roofs be repaired or replaced before further damage occurs.
And I think the other moral of the story here is you can't just evaluate roof damage with a drone. You've got to get up there physically and observe and lift up tiles and lift up shingles and see what's been damaged.
Correct. I mean, the drones will provide an initial sense of the extent of damage, but it will not be as accurate as going over the roof and seeing it for yourself.
Okay, well, let's let Dr. Jain join this party. Anurag is going to discuss wind load provisions in the ASCE and recent changes there.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So now with that great introduction on winds and the different types of winds and what winds can do, it's a good time to talk about building codes. So our building codes are updated on a regular cycle. And they take advantage of lessons learned both in the field from damage investigations, such as the type that John was describing, along with incorporating additional research that has become available. So as part of that process, we have a document called the American Society of Civil Engineers Standard 7, and the latest iteration of that corresponding with this year, current year, 22, came out earlier this year. And the title of the standard is Minimum Design Loads and Associated Criteria for Buildings and Other Structures. It will be adopted in the next version of the International Building Code, which will be in 2024. Now, I'm going to be talking about just the wind load provisions in the standard, and those cover 7 chapters, which have 135 pages, and an associated commentary for those, which is 85 pages. So I'm going to go through all 220 pages of that right now. Sorry, just kidding. And
we'll extend the program 24 hours for everybody's benefit.
And then I'll also go a step further. I will show no equations in this presentation so that you all can breathe easy. So I'm going to quickly go over the organization of the wind load provisions of this standard. I was fortunate to participate in the development and update of this standard. I'll highlight the key changes and new provisions. Going over all of it will be time intensive, and we don't have the time to do that right now. But one key thing which I want to highlight is what are the limitations of the wind load provisions in the building code. Many of you that are attorneys on this presentation would appreciate that, in the sense that what are the boundaries of the building code? What does it not permit? So I think that will be informative. So as I mentioned, the ASCE 722 wind load provisions are organized in 7 chapters. There is chapter 26, which covers the general requirements of the wind load provisions. That lays out various definitions that are there and describes for you what you need to do for coming up with the design wind forces. Now, there are 2 parts of it. One, what we call the main wind force resisting system, and the other part we call the components and cladding. If you draw a parallel to a human being, so the skeleton and muscles would be akin to your main wind force resisting system, and the components and cladding will be like your skin. The skin resists the elements, and then the main wind force resisting system, or the skeleton and the muscles, they resist the forces, and then they also keep the structure standing up. There are several chapters, 4 chapters that are dedicated to the main wind force resisting system. It's a function of building height. It's also a function of maybe appurtenances to a building like rooftop equipment. And for components and cladding, there is a single chapter, chapter 30. Then there is a chapter 31, which is to do with wind tunnel procedures, and it just alludes to those procedures. There is a separate standard for wind tunnel testing. And then recently, in this standard, there was an introduction of a new chapter 32, which is on tornado loads. Now, that chapter on tornado loads is applicable to a certain type of building, buildings where damage to those buildings can cause significant impairment or loss of human life, or they are critical facilities. We define them as risk category 3 and 4 buildings. And in risk category 3 and 4 buildings that are in tornado prone regions are required going forward to be designed for tornado loads. Now, in going through the wind load provisions, the code organizers and authors have developed a way for the reader to identify what changes have been made by putting a light gray colored line in the margins that highlight what the changes are. so the reader can be aware of what changes have come about. So in terms of key changes that have been made, there is simplification in the language, in the code language, but there is more description to make it better understandable and more user-friendly. The design wind speed maps have been updated, specifically for the hurricane coastline. The wind speeds have gone up slightly. And then in the wind speed maps, we have what are called special wind regions, which are typically the presence of mountains or gorges or terrain features which might accelerate the flow of wind. So those have been added and updated. Now, going forward, ASCE has made its hazard tool available to the public. So you can go to this website and take a look at this website, and you can determine site-specific hazard, whether it's wind loads or earthquake loads or floods or tsunami loads. You can use this hazard tool to develop site-specific hazards. Recently, and as Michael had introduced, recently there is also a pre-standard that has been developed, which is called performance-based design for wind forces. That really alludes to the design for structures that don't conform to the confines of the building code. So if you want to design a high-rise building, the building code may not have all the provisions, or a high-rise building may not meet all the prescriptive requirements of the building code. Therefore, you need to have performance requirements, and this building or this pre-standard alludes to that. There are new provisions that have been developed for elevated buildings or buildings on stilts, which you might see along some of the hurricane coastline, which are susceptible to flooding. There has been some reorganization of equations for pressures, where the directionality factor is no longer a part of the velocity pressure. It's been moved to the rest of the equation. So it's still there, but it's in a different location. As John described, variation of wind pressures over height, the factors that compute that and provide for the engineers to use in their calculations, those have been modified for site exposures B and C. You might be familiar with these, which refer to exposure C is more a suburban exposure, and B is more urban. And then one thing that has happened throughout the standard is in the previous version of the standard, there were tabulations of wind pressure. So depending on the size and height of your building, and depending on the exposure, you could just go into tabulated values of pressures and use those. However, it was found out that there are some discrepancies between the tabulated values and hand calculated values. So the tabulated values have been removed. And more importantly, based on the survey, it was found that hardly anybody used those tabulated values. So it sort of simplifies the code. There are new provisions that have been added for ground-mounted fixed tilt solar panel systems. Previously, there were provisions for rooftop mounted solar equipment, but now new provisions have been added for ground mounted as well. Similarly, similar to chapters 27 and 28 and 29, where the tabulated values have been removed. For components and cladding, the tabulated values of design pressures have been removed. The pressure diagrams for roofs have been simplified, so they are easier to use and they contain more detail. There have been new provisions that have been introduced for canopies attached to buildings for buildings taller than 60 feet. And there are also new provisions for pavers on low slope roofs. Those pavers can fly off if they are not properly designed. Most of the times these pavers are just loose laid on the rooftop. So there are provisions there now. In the wind tunnel procedure chapter now, there are definitions for using wind tunnel results or reports for sites that are for specific sites or for multiple sites. For example, a solar farm. There could be a similar solar farm that will be installed at multiple locations. So there are provisions now for that. And then provisions have also been added for performing a peer review on wind tunnel tests. As I described, a new chapter has been introduced on tornado loads. This is applicable where the tornado risk wind speed is greater than 60 miles per hour. And it's typically covers tornadoes in the classification of enhanced Fujita 0 to enhanced Fujita level 2 tornado. Beyond that, it's considered excessive, so it's not designed for those, or these risk category 3 and 4 buildings will not be required to be designed for the extreme tornadoes. And the tornado risk is a function of the building size. So let's say if you have a giant warehouse and if a tornado is going by, you have a higher probability of getting struck by a tornado compared to a small building, like maybe a small building which houses a generator system. John already went through this, but I wanted to take this opportunity to define something that is we as engineers and students are frequently taught that wind speeds are static, and we consider those wind forces as static. But in reality, winds are dynamic, as you saw from those videos. They change speed and direction, and the loads they impose change with time as well. So here, what we are seeing is a tornado simulator at the Iowa State University, and the results from which were used for developing some of the tornado load provisions. I was fortunate to go and observe the testing or a run of the tornado simulator. But what I wanted to point out is that the wind load consists of several components. The static component or a steady component. You may recall that light colored gray line in the chart that John showed. So that's a static part of the wind. And then there is a dynamic component of the wind, which is varying with time on top of that static wind load. Now, even that dynamic wind load is made up of three different components, up to three different components. One is based on the turbulence in the oncoming flow, and it's called the non-resonant component. The second part is due to the dynamic characteristic of the building itself. So if that matches with the characteristics of the oncoming flow, there might be resonance. It might, those might coincide, and it may create a resonant or an inertial response. And finally, the third component is aeroelastic. When the winds and the structure are such that the structure itself moves a significant amount, and that movement will create and generate loads. It can also reduce loads, but that has a component to it. And for longer and more flexible structures like taller buildings or long span bridges, that aeroelastic component is important. Next, I'll spend a few minutes on talking about limitations on the provisions of the wind loads in ASCE 722. The provisions will say that it's applicable to buildings that do not have response characteristics that make them subject to a cross wind loading, vortex shedding, galloping or flutter, channeling effects, or buffeting in the wake of upwind obstructions. However, those are not defined in the wind load provisions. And then it clearly says if the limitation section is if you have a building or structure that has unusual shape or response characteristics, then you cannot use the provisions of the standard. And instead, you need to rely on recognized literature or use wind tunnel to identify what those design loads should be. So let me sort of try and define for you what some of those limitations are and the impact of that on buildings. So vortex shedding. What happens is if a wind flow approaches a bluff body or a shape, like our civilian structures, then there will be separation of the flow that happens, and the separation of the flow generates vortices, and vortices typically shed from one side and then the other. You can see the green and magenta or purple vortices are getting shed alternately. So now that alternate shedding of vortices will create a suction pressure, which will pull the building to one side of the structure to one side and then push it back to the other side. So that will create an oscillation, and that it generates wind loads. Now, on the figure below, what is seen is just vortex shedding in nature. So as winds and clouds go by islands or other formations, then even that will cause vortex shedding to happen. These images have been taken by NOAA satellites, and they show how vortices appear in nature. If you go to a stream for fishing or on the base of a bridge, you might see vortices being shed just by the flow of water. One example that comes to mind is in a building, there were architectural columns installed, and these columns were slender, and their characteristics were such that they were prone to vortex-induced vibration, but they were not really considered during the design. And when vortex shedding happens, the resonant frequency of the structure locks in with the frequency of the oncoming wind excitation, and that can cause high amplitude vibrations, and that can result in fatigue, and then it could be damaged. A crosswind loading. Most of tall buildings are governed by crosswind loading, meaning like I was describing vortex shedding. So winds are coming in this direction, if you can see my hand, but vortex shedding will create movement in a direction perpendicular to the direction of wind flow, and that's also called a crosswind loading. And if you can imagine a structure whose plan shape is triangular, and if wind comes to it from the side, the wind forces will not just be in this direction, but they will cause it to move in the up and down direction as well. I'm sure you all have seen videos of Galloping Gertie or the old Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Tacoma, Washington, that collapsed at a gentle wind speed of 42 miles per hour 4 months after it had been built. And the reason for the collapse of that was flutter. It's frequently defined or referred to as resonance. It's not quite resonance, but it's flutter. And when flutter happens, that's an aeroelastic phenomenon. And we discussed that is the third component of dynamic wind loads. And when that happens, negative damping or negative aerodynamic damping is there in the system. And instead of damping the system or damping the motion down, it actually amplifies it until it reaches an amplitude where catastrophic failure can happen. I was fortunate to visit the old Tacoma Narrows Bridge as a graduate student and climb one of those towers, and that's a picture from there, from top of the towers. Channeling effects, where we are based in Southern California, you hear of wildfires that are there, and you hear of wind-driven wildfires. So that's because hot winds from the high deserts of Utah and Nevada and Arizona come towards California, and they have to pass through mountains and canyons. And when they get funneled through those narrow gaps in a Venturi effect, they amplify. And because of that amplification, those winds can be really strong and powerful, and they accelerate the wind flow, resulting in a higher response or higher wind loads. Buffeting in the wake of upwind obstructions. So in this image, you see are several high-rise buildings in close proximity to each other, but the building in the middle is boarded up heavily with plywood. And that's because of buffeting due to upwind obstructions, and also more funneling and possible generation of windborne debris that impacted this particular structure. And that can also result in higher wind loads. So the last couple of slides that are there, keeping in mind the time that we have left, the key takeaways for you and the key issues to consider as you are thinking about winds and wind forces and wind storms. In the evaluation of that, has the windstorm speed been properly estimated? Are there localized phenomena that might have affected the subject location or property? The proper interaction of the storm's wind with the structure need to be considered. For example, the few things I've described previously. Then is it adequate to compare the design wind speeds to the storm wind speeds? For example, Mike had referred to older buildings. Older buildings were designed to a certain level of winds, but they were also designed to different provisions in the wind load codes. Is it just adequate to compare the wind speeds, or we have to look at what those wind speeds generate in terms of pressures? So looking at pressures is more critical than looking at wind speeds. Obviously, you need the wind speed to compute the pressures, but without looking at pressures, the evaluation is sort of incomplete. And have the pressure calculations been done in a manner which considers all the factors that are involved in those calculations. As you all know, all building materials and components have to comply with certain specifications and meet certain test standards, and they have to submit pressures and evaluation and test results for them to be approved for use in construction. Now, those tests are done in laboratory controlled environment, and everything is perfect and precise. And do they match with field conditions? And so is it appropriate to compare test pressures to in situ conditions? For example, Mike referenced deterioration with age and passage of time. Maybe there's a maintenance component also to it that has to be considered. John referenced corner zones. So as the building shape and orientation and upwind terrain being properly quantified and considered. And in the right codes and standard and their provisions being properly applied in the assessment of a particular structure. In the past, in hurricanes and storms, there have been references to a pinpoint strike, especially when it came to wind versus water. Is that possible? It is. We saw that video where a tornado just went over a building. It is possible, but I think it has to be properly taken into consideration. And then meteorologist reports have to be obtained. And then also, we shouldn't take those as gospel either, because many times meteorologists rely on radars, and those radars have their beams at several thousand feet above the property. Now, if there is localized phenomenon or non-synoptic type of winds, does the wind speeds always reduce with height? And we saw how those graphs look like, the nose shape profile, where winds could be higher closer to the ground and less so at an elevation. So those have to be properly considered and kept in mind as the different components of the property are being evaluated, and whether they are damaged or not to be identified. We also have to consider manufacturing tolerances, construction, whether the construction will was adequate or matched installation requirements, environmental loads that impact a property on a regular basis, and whether the maintenance or lack of maintenance contributed to the current condition. And then, with all of these non-storm issues, the impact of those on the performance or the magnitude of them versus the magnitude of the wind loads during a storm have to be evaluated. In many instances, we come across an opinion which said, I said so based on my 30, 40 years of experience. Is that adequate? Has any analysis been done to back up a hypothesis or not? And then when repairs are to be performed, whether the repairs will return that specific component to their pre-loss strength or pre-loss capacity to resist wind loads that they were designed to resist. So those are the key takeaways. And then in terms of if you are curious and if you want to look further, there's a number of resources that are available for you to consider. One particular one, which is geared for folks that are not very familiar with wind load, is an ASCE publication titled Wind Issues in the Design of Buildings. It's a fairly straightforward document, and it's easy to read. That'll give you a good place to start. And there's a number of other publications that you could look at, several by ASCE that are focused on wind forces. And you could look at those to derive more information about wind and wind structure interaction. With that, I think we've used up the hour, so sorry we ran over a few minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions.
We do, in fact, have a few questions, although we are a little bit out of time. The first question we have is, someone has asked you to comment on the ASTM test for water penetration in installed windows and credentials for those performing the test.
I did not talk about those specific tests, but the standards are there, and the qualifications of people performing those tests. I don't believe it. Those standards require specific qualifications, but I'm, obviously following the ASTM standard procedures and the experience of the testers should be done.
One other question that we have is, and this is a question that I have as well, what type of modeling can be done either in the design phase or the investigative phase to take into account all these calculations, factors, and elements when looking at these impacts of severe winds on building structures?
Well, that's a great question. And, based on our work that we have done, and especially investigating a lot of structures and buildings that have had issues with performance during a storm. So we try to take this back to code organizations, and even actually you'd be surprised at how many professors in structural and wind engineering programs I've spoken to tell them that, hey, you need to start at school and get away from teaching kids that winds are static. So you need to impart that information right from the beginning. So I believe codes and standards are becoming more expanded, and they try and answer those questions. But at the end of the day, it's up to the design professional to be aware of what they're doing, because then they are putting their seal and signature on the design documents.
Dr. Simsir, do you have any final comments, words of wisdom for our attendees here today?
No, I think that's it. Thank you very much for having us. I'll be happy to answer any other questions if others have after the meeting. We're available by email or phone.
Absolutely. If anybody has any follow-up questions, you can find Dr. Jain and Dr. Simsir at Walker Consultants in Los Angeles. My email is mike@lanelaw.co. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, and we really do appreciate everybody's time. Although we went a little bit over time today, we've enjoyed giving this presentation. Thank you very much.
Likewise. Thank you for
Thank you.
attending.